Welcome back to the Obby series. In today's episode, we are going to be implementing the Gravity and Speed Coil Gamepasses into our game. And if you're unfamiliar with what the Gravity Coil or Speed Coil actually does, basically there's going to be two buttons on the right hand side here, similar to how the VIP button is set up, where once a player clicks on them, they'll be prompted to purchase the Game Pass, and once they purchase the Game Pass for either the Gravity Coil or the Speed Coil, they'll be able to use them. And the effects that they receive for the coils is when they have the Gravity Coil out, they'll be able to jump higher and the gravity will be a little bit lower. Then if they're using the Speed Coil, well, they'll be a lot faster. Now, before we get into actually scripting this entire system, you're going to want to go down below into the description, and towards the top of the description, there's going to be a link to my website, which once you click it, it'll start downloading a file called Super Simple Obby Coils. Inside of this file, there's going to be two images. Those images are going to be used as the Game Pass icons, and then there's going to be an RBXM file, which is called Tools, and we can import that directly inside of Roblox Studio in order to get both of the coil models already made for us. And like I said, the link in the description is a direct download link. So literally as soon as you click it, it's going to start downloading. So I don't want anybody to feel weird or anything by this. I just don't really want to make an entire page and dedicate an entire page on my website to this, because this is sort of an afterthought and probably something that I should have included in either the icon pack or maybe even the original Super Simple Obby starter pack. But instead, I just decided to quickly throw this into a zip file, upload it to the website, and allow you guys to download it this way. So anyway, once you have that file downloaded, as usual, make sure you extract the file so that you're able to access it, so that it turns into a folder and you're able to access it. Then we'll go inside of Roblox Studio and actually begin importing those. So first, we'll go ahead and upload the images. So we'll go inside of the View tab, we'll click on Asset Manager, and then we'll click the Bulk Import button, and then we'll go ahead and select both of those images. And now that we've uploaded both those images to Studio, the next thing that we're going to do is import the coil models. So we'll go ahead and right-click inside of the replicated storage. We'll then click Insert from File, and then we'll select the tools.rbxm file and click Open. Then once you've done that, you should see that there is now a folder inside of your replicated storage called Tools, and inside of there should be two different tool objects, one called Gravity Coil and another called Speed Coil. So as long as you have all those things inside of there, you are good to go. We can then close the Asset Manager, and we can also collapse the replicated storage as well. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and begin by creating the two GUI buttons for both of the Game Passes. So we're going to go inside of the Star GUI, inside of the right screen GUI, inside of the frame, and now we have two buttons inside of here. Let's go ahead and duplicate one of the buttons. Then we'll rename this to be called Gravity without any space, and then we'll say Coil. So Gravity, no space, Coil. Then we'll open that up. Inside of here, of course, we have a title text label and an icon image label, which we need to update. For the title text label, I'm going to update the text of this to just say Gravity. If you want to, you might be able to have it say Gravity Coil, but I kind of think that might be too much text to have inside of there, so I'm going to go ahead and just stick with Gravity. Then for the icon image label, of course, we'll go ahead and update the image to actually be the Gravity Coil image that we just uploaded, just like that. So now that we have that button finished, let's go ahead and duplicate that button once. Then we'll go ahead and rename this one to be called Speed Coil. Of course, inside of here, we need to go ahead and update the text label to say Speed instead of Gravity. Then we'll go ahead and update the icon image label to actually have the icon of the Speed Coil, just like that. Then the last thing I'm going to do is go ahead and adjust the layout order of each of these. For VIP, I want that to appear all the way towards the top, so I'm going to leave the layout order of this at 0. Then I'm going to want the Gravity and Speed Coil directly below that, and then for the Reset button to appear all the way at the bottom. So for the Gravity Coil, I'm going to go ahead and set the layout order to 1. For the Speed Coil, I'm going to go ahead and set that to 2. And then for the Reset button, I'm going to go ahead and set that to 3 so that it appears all the way at the very bottom. And now that we've done that, we have each of these buttons set up, so we can go ahead and collapse the frame, collapse the right GUI, and collapse the starter GUI as well. Awesome. Now that we've done that, we can go ahead and begin creating the two Game Passes for both of these coils. Unfortunately, we're not able to create Game Passes inside of Roblox Studio. We actually have to go to a creator dashboard, but in my opinion, the easiest way to access the creator dashboard is going to the game settings, going to monetization, and then clicking the create button next to badges, which should go ahead and open up the creator dashboard for you. Of course, from here, we need to go ahead and select our game. And then once we have our game selected, we'll look on the left-hand side. We want to go to the monetization tab, and then we'll go ahead and open up the passes section. Now that we're inside of here, we can of course go ahead and click the create a pass button. Of course, we need to go ahead and use an image, so we'll go ahead and upload the Speed Coil image. I'll go ahead and call this Speed Coil. And for the description of this, I'm going to say move at the speed of lightning, and then I'll go ahead and click on Create Pass. Now that we've created that pass, let's go ahead and create the Gravity Coil pass. So I've added the image. We'll go ahead and name this Gravity Coil, and for the description, we're going to say move like we're on the moon. Now that we filled all of that information in, let's go ahead and create a pass. And now that we have both of those created, the last thing we have to do is actually put them to be on sale, because by default, they're set to off sale and nobody can actually buy them. So we'll go ahead and select the Gravity Coil. We'll go to the sales section. Then we'll set the item for sale. I'm going to set the price of this to just be 1 Robux, and then I'll click on Save Changes. Now that we've done that for the gravity coil, we have to do the same thing for the speed coil. So we'll click the speed coil, we'll go to the sales, we'll set it to be on sale, and I'm going to set the price to just be 1. Then I'll click save changes, and now we have both of those game passes successfully created. One of the last things that we're going to need to do is actually get the asset ID of both of these. So what I would recommend that you do is click the 3 dots towards the top right hand corner of the Game Pass, then click on copy asset ID, and just write these 2 IDs down somewhere. Maybe you open up a notepad and put them both inside of there, or you can even just keep this web page open and then grab these IDs when we actually need them in a couple of minutes. Anyways, returning back to Studio, we can go ahead and exit out of the game settings, and now we're actually ready to begin scripting. So to begin scripting, the first thing that I want to do is actually update the store config. So to do this, we're going to go inside of the replicated storage, inside of the configs folder, and open up the store module script. Now, inside of here, what we're going to want to do is create another type above our store item info type. This type is going to be shared amongst any scripts which require this one, so let's go ahead and say export type, and the name of this type is going to be called Gamepass name, and it's going to be a string union where we store all of the names of each of our different game passes. And at least in this context, we only have 2 different game passes, one for the gravity coil and one for the speed coil. So let's go ahead and write that out. Of course, the first one's going to be called gravity coil, and then for the second one, it's going to be called speed coil. The reason that we're creating this type is because we're going to use this type in different functions in order to make it easier for us while we're scripting, because when we use these types, we'll have auto completion suggested to us, and it'll make it a lot easier to avoid making grammar mistakes or small little mistakes like that while we're scripting. Now that we've created that type, the next thing we want to do is actually update the store variable, and more specifically, we want to actually update the game passes table, because inside of here is where we want to add our 2 brand new game passes. So I'm going to go ahead and create a table inside of the Game Passes table. Then we'll go ahead and add in the ID property. And then we can go ahead and paste in the asset ID of either a gravity coil or a speed coil. Then we'll go ahead and add a comma at the end of this table. We'll go ahead, copy and paste this to create our second table. And then let's go ahead and paste in the second ID for the other Game Pass, just like that. Now that we've added both these Game Passes to our store config, we have to go ahead and create a couple of different functions to make it easier for us while we're working with Game Passes. So above the generate store function, we're going to create a brand new function, which again is going to be a part of the local table. And we're going to go ahead and call this Populate Product Info. And what this function is going to do is pretty similar to the logic that's actually written down here. So essentially, this iterates through all of the subscriptions inside of the subscriptions table and then fills in that table with all of the other information about that specific subscription, all from its subscription ID. So essentially, we're going to do the same thing in this function, but this function can actually be used for both Game Passes and developer products. So that's why we're calling this Populate Product Info, even though really it could probably be called Populate Game Pass and Product Info, but I don't really know what the best way to actually call that is, so that's why I just named it this. Anyway, this function is going to have 2 parameters. The first parameter is going to be called products, which is actually going to be a table, because we're going to pass through either the Game Passes table or the products table to this function. And then the second parameter is going to be called info type, which is going to be of the enum.enum type. And essentially, the info type enum is used with the method that we're using from the marketplace service in order to specify whether the info that we're wanting to get belongs to a developer product or a Game Pass, for example. So now that we've created that function, like I said, what we're going to want to do is iterate through all of the products. So we're going to go ahead and create a for loop by saying for underscore comma product in products do. Then we'll go ahead and create a variable called info, and to get the info about the specific product, we need to go ahead and use the marketplace service, and we need to use a method of it called get product info. For the first argument of this function, we need to pass through the ID of the product. So we'll go ahead and say product.id. And then for the second argument, we need to pass through the actual info type to specify the type of information that we want to retrieve. So we can just go ahead and pass through info type, which is provided to this function. And actually, now I can see when I was making this for loop, I said in product instead of in products. So make sure that that is actually plural, because obviously you can't iterate through a single product, as that literally makes no sense. We have to iterate through the products, which is the table that's given to us. Anyways, now that we've gotten the info about the specific product, let's go ahead and update this product with all that other information. So we can honestly literally just copy all the code from down here and paste it directly up here. Of course, instead of saying subscription though, we would say product.name equals info.name, product.description equals info.description, product.price equals info.price. But with the price, we actually have to make one minor change. Instead of saying info.price, we actually have to say info.price in Robux. The reason for that is because the info that is returned from the get product info function, the key that they use for the price is not called price, it is literally called price in Robux, which is why we need to specify that right here. Then we'll go ahead and update the subscription.image to say product.image, and that's exactly the same as how we do below, so we don't have to update anything to the right of that. But anyways, now that we've ran all of that logic out, we're actually fully finished with creating this function, and we can go ahead and begin using it. Now, where are we going to use it? Well, we're actually going to use it inside of the generate store function, because already this function handles generating the subscriptions, and we only actually generate the subscription information based on if this module is ran on the client side. But when it comes to Game Passes and developer products, we want to do this on both the server and the client side. So towards the top of the generate store function, we're going to go ahead and write local.populate product info, and then we'll go ahead and pass through the Game Passes table. So we'll say shared.store.gamepasses, and for the info type, we'll go ahead and say enum.infotype.gamepass. So that'll go ahead and generate all of the information about our Game Passes. Now that we've done that, we're going to want to create two more functions. So we're going to go below where we actually call the generate store function, and we're going to go ahead and create a brand new function, which is going to be a part of the shared table. And this function is going to be called Get Gamepass Info. And it's going to have a single parameter, which is going to be called ID, and that's going to be a string. And we can also specify the return type of this because it's actually going to return some store item info. Now, with this function, although our parameter is called ID, we want to be able to use this function by passing through either the ID or the name of the Game Pass in order to retrieve all of the information about it. And it's actually really easy to make it possible to get that information using either the ID or the name. So to do this, what we need to do is we need to iterate through all of the Game Passes inside of the store table. So we're going to say for _ Gamepass info in shared.store.gamepasses do. Then what we want to do is we want to check if the Gamepass info.id is the same as the ID that's been passed through to here. Or we would like to check if the Gamepass info.name is the same as the ID which was passed to here as well. Now this might seem a little bit weird because we're comparing the ID to the ID, or we're comparing the name to the ID, and you might think, well, we should compare the name to the name. But like I said, even though we're naming the parameter ID here, what we're doing is we're allowing this function to actually be able to find that information by passing through both the ID or the name as well. It can be either or. It doesn't just have to actually be the ID. So then once we actually find the Game Pass which matches that ID or that name, what we're going to do is return the Game Pass info just like that. Then below this function, we're going to go ahead and create one more function, which again is going to be a part of the shared table. And this function is going to be called Does Player Own Game Pass? And it's going to have two parameters. The first parameter is going to be data, which will actually be the player's data. And the second parameter is going to be called ID, which is going to be either a number or a string. And this function is going to return a Boolean. Now, whenever this function is called, the first thing that we're going to do is make this function compatible with both the Game Pass ID and the name of the Game Pass as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to say ID equals, and then we'll use that function that we just created. So we'll say shared.getGamepassinfo and pass through the ID, and then we'll actually get the ID from that. So again, we're doing this in order to allow this function to work with both the ID or the name. Then what we're going to do is actually look inside of the player's data to determine if they actually have purchased the Game Pass or not. Now, we haven't updated the player's data to reflect this, but if you've been following the series along the entire time, you should be able to follow along and understand how we would actually check if the player owns the Game Pass inside of the player's data or not before we actually add it. To do this, what we're going to say is we're going to return the result of this, and then we're going to go inside of the player's data. We'll go inside of their Game Passes table, which again, like I said, we haven't added this to the player's data yet, but we're going to after this. Then we're going to index that table with the ID of the Game Pass. Now remember, all Game Pass IDs are numbers. The thing is though, is that when it comes to Roblox's networking, meaning data is being replicated from the server down to the client, if you're replicating a dictionary, which is a table, and remember, dictionaries are tables with key value pairs. So if you're replicating a dictionary, and for your key value pairs, you use numbers for your keys, Roblox can get very weird when it comes to using numbers as keys when it comes to replicating them over to the client side. So what I do is I never actually store numbers as keys inside of dictionaries that I know will be replicated down to the client side. Instead, what I do is I use the toString method to convert that number to a string, which completely circumvents the issue of things becoming very weird. So that's why we're going to index the Game Passes table with the ID, but as a string instead of a number. And now that we've done that, we're actually fully finished with creating this function. And that's actually all that we had to do inside of the store config in total, so we can go ahead and close out of this. Now that we've done that, we are finished with modifying any config, so we can collapse that folder. But the next thing that I want to do is actually update the player's data. So to do this, we of course can go inside of the replicated storage and open up the player data module script. Now, towards the top of the script, we want to go ahead and require the store config. So let's go ahead and create a variable for that. We'll say configs.store, and then we'll go ahead and rename the variable as well to be called store config. Then we're going to go ahead and update the player data type. So after we add in the VIP, we then want to go ahead and add in Game Passes, which will specify the type of this to be a table. And now this table table is going to hold the IDs of every single Game Pass as a key, but those IDs are going to be converted to strings. So we're going to go ahead and specify the key as being a string, whereas the value is going to be a boolean, which of course that boolean will be either true or false for each of the Game Pass IDs based on if the player owns that Game Pass or not. And I feel like I'm being pretty repetitive at this point, but like I said, the reason that we're converting the ID of the Game Pass from a number to a string is because when numbers are used inside of a dictionary that is replicated from the server to the client side, Roblox can be very weird with tables like that and severely mess those tables up. So what I always do is I convert those numbers that are used as keys over to a string in order to circumvent that issue entirely. Anyways, now that we've updated the type, we have to go ahead and actually update the player data variable. But before we do that, we want to do something similar to what we do for the codes data and the settings data. So we're going to go ahead and create a variable called Gamepasses data, which is going to be equal to a blank table. Then what we're going to do is iterate through all of the Game Passes. So we're going to say for underscore comma Game Pass info in store config dot store dot game passes do. Then what we're going to do is index the Game Passes data table with the ID of the Game Pass. But remember, we want to use toString to convert that ID to a string. Now that we're using toString, we'll go ahead and say Game Pass info dot ID. And then we're going to set the value of that Game Pass to false because by default, players do not own any of our Game Passes. Now that we've created that data table, we can go ahead and update the default player data variable. So after VIP, we'll go ahead and add Game Passes and set that equal to Game Passes data, just like that. Now, if you've been following the series for a while, you probably already know the pattern that's going to happen next. Since we finished updating the player data, the next thing we need to do is actually update the state manager. So let's go ahead and close out of the player data module. Inside of the replicated storage, we want to go ahead and expand the functions folder, and inside of here, let's go ahead and update the update state module. Of course, first things first, we need to go ahead and add in another update state action. So below our update VIP action, let's go ahead and add in another action. For the type of this, we're going to go ahead and call it update Game Pass. Now it will have the value, which is going to also be a boolean, but in addition to that, it's also going to have the Game Pass ID, which we're going to specify as a string. And of course, we need the Game Pass ID in order to actually update the player's data to set the specific Game Pass that the player now owns or no longer owns, for example. Now that we've added that action, let's go ahead and reformat this text real quick. Oops, I kind of messed that last line up, but cool, there we go. And now that we've updated the type, let's go ahead and update the function as well. We'll scroll all the way down below where we added the update VIP action. We'll then say else if action.type equals update Game Pass. Then what are we going to do? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to go inside of the player data. We're going to go inside of the Game Passes table. Then we'll go ahead and index that. Now, what are we going to index that with? Well, we're going to go ahead and index that with the action.GamePassID. But to make this as safe as possible, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and convert that to a string, just in case the Game Pass ID that we provided here was actually in the number form and not the string form. Now, I understand that when we created the action type, we specified that it should be a string, but there's literally no harm in being extra precautious and converting an already existing string into itself. Literally nothing will actually change there. But if we were to not convert it to a string here and we accidentally passed a number to here, then that would cause the entire system to have an issue. So it's better to be precautious and possibly convert an already existing string into a string once again, which literally does nothing, than not be precautious. Anyways, now that we've actually found the Game Pass that we're looking for, let's go ahead and update the value of it. So we'll go ahead and say action.value. Just like that. And now we've updated the state manager, so we can go ahead and close out of this module script. And now we're pretty much finished with everything inside the replicated storage, so we can go ahead and collapse that. The next thing that we're going to do is go ahead and update the store service to implement purchasing Game Passes and rewarding those items on the server side. So we'll go inside of the server script service, we'll go inside the services folder, and then we'll go ahead and open up the store service module. Now inside of here, the first thing that we're going to want to do is go ahead and create a function which is going to handle when a player purchases a Game Pass. Now, I don't really like to go out of order, but to provide more context, inside of the onStart function, we're going to listen to a specific event which is fired off whenever a player purchases a Game Pass. And the event that we're going to listen to is a part of the marketplace service, and it is actually called prompt Game Pass purchase finished. Now, if we then say :connect and we begin creating an anonymous function, it'll suggest to us function anonymous autofilled, and then we can click enter, and that'll kind of write out the entire anonymous function and actually type out all of the parameters. And the only reason that we're actually doing this is to show you what information we actually receive from this event. So we receive the player, we receive the Game Pass ID, and we receive a boolean, which is if it was purchased or not. The reason that we have was purchased as a boolean is because this event is called Prompt Game Pass Purchase Finished. And how this event actually works is when the player is prompted to purchase a Game Pass, this event will be fired off whether the player presses OK to confirm purchasing it or cancel to decline purchasing it. And their decision will be reflected by the was purchased Boolean argument here. So that's why we're getting was purchased. Now anyways, we're not actually using the anonymous function here at all. If we really wanted to, we could actually just delete that and kind of leave it like this, because what we're going to do is actually connect this to a function that we're creating. But like I said, I just kind of wanted to add this here to give you the context of what information is given to us from this event in order to make it a little bit easier to understand exactly what we're doing with the function that we're creating for this. So anyway, let's go down towards the very bottom of our script, and we'll go ahead and create a brand new function, which is going to be part of the local table, and we'll go ahead and call this Purchase Gamepass. And this function is going to have all the parameters for each of the arguments that we saw earlier. So first, we're going to go ahead and accept the player, which I don't know why they specify as an instance. I don't know if it actually is just a literal instance. I'm pretty sure that it is actually a player though, but maybe they either messed up the typing or maybe I am incorrect. Either way, it doesn't really actually matter. For the second parameter, we of course get the ID, which is a number. And then for the third parameter, we of course have did purchase, which is a Boolean. Now, the first thing we want to do inside of this function is if the player did not actually purchase the Game Pass, then we can just stop the function right here because we don't need to do anything for somebody who hasn't purchased the Game Pass. So we'll say if not did purchase, then return end. Then after that, we want to go ahead and get the player state. So we'll go ahead and create a variable called state. And of course, we can get the player state by using the player data service .get state, pass through the player. And if we do not get the state, then let's go ahead and stop the function right there. Now that we've gotten the player state, let's go ahead and check if the player already owns the Game Pass or not. So we'll go ahead and create a variable called owns Game Pass. And to check if the player owns the Game Pass or not, we can use a function that we created inside of the store config. So we'll say store config.does player own Game Pass. We'll go ahead and pass through the player state and the ID of the Game Pass. And like I said, if the player already owns the Game Pass, then we'll go ahead and stop the function right there. But now if the player does not own the Game Pass, then let's go ahead and update their data to reflect that they do now own the Game Pass. So we'll go ahead and create a variable called action, which of course is going to be of the player data service .update state action type, which is going to be a table. And inside of that table, we'll go ahead and specify the type of this to be update Game Pass. Then for the value, we'll of course go ahead and set that to be true. And then finally for the Game Pass ID, we'll go ahead and specify that to be the ID. And now that we've created that action, let's go ahead and use it. So we'll go ahead and say player data service .update state. We'll pass through the player, and then we'll go ahead and pass through the action. So now we're updating the player's state to reflect that they do own the Game Pass. And you may have forgotten, but during the badges episode, we created a badge that's given to any player who purchases a Game Pass or a developer product or even a subscription. So we should implement that logic here as well. So we'll go ahead and use the badges config. We'll say reward badge. We'll pass through the player, and the name of the badge that we want to reward is the supporter badge. Now, this is not something that we can do yet. We actually have to come back to this function after we create a service. But I'm going to go ahead and leave a comment here which says to do, because another thing that we want to do here is when a player purchases the Game Pass for either of the coils, we need to actually reward those coils to the player in the game as well. So I'm just going to leave a comment here which says reward player. And like I said, after we actually create the service for rewarding those coils, we'll go ahead and add that logic right into here. But anyways, now that we've actually created this function, we can go ahead and use it. And we'll use it by connecting it to the prompt Game Pass purchase finished event. So like I said, we'll go ahead and connect this to the local.purchase Game Pass function, just like that. So we're now handling what happens when a player purchases a Game Pass while they're inside of our game, but we cannot forget that players are actually able to purchase Game Passes from the Roblox website when they are not inside of the game. So we also need to handle that in a different way. So we're going to go ahead and create another function, which again is going to be a part of the local table, and this is going to be called process Game Pass from website. Now that's a pretty long name, but the only parameter for this function is going to be a player. Now with this function, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to iterate through all of the Game Passes inside of the game and check if the player owns any of those Game Passes. Because if the player does own any of those Game Passes, then what we're going to do is have their state updated to reflect that they do own those Game Passes. So first things first, like I said, we're going to iterate through all of the Game Passes. So we're going to say for _ comma Gamepass info in store config .store .gamepasses do. Then we'll create a variable called owns Game Pass. And now to determine if a player owns a Game Pass or not, we're going to go ahead and use the marketplace service. We can then use the user owns Game Pass async method. We have to pass through the player's user ID and the ID of the Game Pass. So we'll say GamePassInfo.id. And now if the player does own the Game Pass, then we want to go ahead and update the player's state, which we can actually easily do by using the function that we just created. So we'll go ahead and call local.purchase Gamepass. We'll then pass through the player and the Game Pass ID, so GamePassInfo.id, and we'll say true because the player did just purchase that Game Pass. So then that function will handle the rest of the logic, which is updating the player's state, rewarding them with a specific badge, and then also giving them the coils if those are one of the Game Passes that they did actually purchase. And now we've ran all this logic, we're finished with creating this function, but now we actually have to use it. And where are we going to use it? Well, we're going to go ahead and use it inside of the onStart function. More specifically, when the player's profile has been loaded, so basically when the player joins the game for the first time. So once the player joins the game, we're going to go ahead and try to process their subscription. In addition to that though, let's go ahead and also try to process the Game Pass purchased from website as well, passing through the player just like that. Cool, so now we're handling both when the player purchases a Game Pass while they're inside of our game, or when a player purchases a Game Pass while they're not inside of our game, and instead they usually purchase it through the website, for example. Now, of course, there might be a little edge case here where if somebody is playing your game and then they purchase the Game Pass on the website, in order for them to receive that Game Pass, it most likely means that they probably have to rejoin the game. But in my opinion, that's a perfectly fine and acceptable edge case to have here. I think that it is an extremely small likelihood of that edge case ever actually happening. Like, I don't think it's common at all for people to be inside of a Roblox game, being able to purchase a Game Pass, but instead choosing to purchase it through the website. And then also at the end of the day, all they literally have to do is rejoin the game. So the next time they join the game, if for some reason they feel like they've been scammed or something, the next time they join the game, they'll realize, oh, I just got my Game Pass stuff now. So now that we've updated the store service module, what we're going to do next is actually update the Store GUI module in order to work with the Game Pass buttons that we've just added. Now keep in mind that we will actually come back to modifying the store service, and we even need to create another service, but the way that I'm trying to organize this episode is we're going to do everything store related first, and then after the store related stuff is finished, we'll then move on to doing all the coil related stuff, so we're kind of keeping it organized that way. Alternatively, I guess I could do everything on the server side first, then move over to doing everything on the client side first, but I feel like this organization method might be a little bit better, doing all the store stuff together, and then doing all the coil stuff together. Makes it a little bit less confusing in my opinion, but hey, what do I know? So anyways, you can either keep the store service module open or closed, it really doesn't matter. Like I said though, we are going to come back to it, so I'm going to go ahead and just leave it open. But now let's go ahead and update the Store GUI script. So inside of the Start Player, inside of the Start Player scripts, inside of the controllers folder, inside of the GUIs folder, we have the Store module script. Let's go ahead and open that up. Now, inside of here, the first thing that we want to do is scroll all the way down to the Setup button function, and inside of here, we now need to update this a little bit to also accommodate for Game Passes. So above the isOwn variable, to make this variable a little bit smaller, because if we don't do this, this variable can become very long and kind of become almost going off the screen, for example, we want to go ahead and create a variable called state. Of course, to get the player state, we would use the state controller and then use the get state function. And I accidentally used a minus symbol instead of an equal symbol to create that variable. But anyway, there we go. Now that we've actually gotten the state, what we're going to do is update the isOwn variable. So right here, we say if is Game Pass, then true. Instead, what we want to do is actually check if the Game Pass is owned or not. So to do that, we can actually use the store config, and we'll use the does player own Game Pass function. Then we'll go ahead and pass through the player state, as well as the ID. So we'll say info.id. And then to determine if VIP is owned or the subscription is owned, what we're currently doing is saying statecontroller.getState.vip, but we can make that a little bit smaller by literally just saying state.vip, just like that. So now the isOwn variable is accounting for both Game Passes by using the does player own Game Pass function, and it's also accounting for the VIP like it was originally. Then, when we listen for any of the buttons to actually be clicked, we need to update this a little bit as well to accommodate for Game Passes. So if the button that they clicked on is one of our Game Pass buttons, and they don't already own that Game Pass, what do we want to do? Well, we want to go ahead and prompt the player to purchase that Game Pass. And how can we do this? Well, similar to how we do it for the subscription, we can go ahead and use the marketplace service. We'll use the prompt Game Pass purchase method, go ahead and pass through the player and the info.id. Cool, so with those changes, what we've essentially done is updated this function to account for Game Passes, so it'll check if the Game Pass is owned or not, and then if the Game Pass is not owned, then we'll go ahead and prompt the player to purchase the Game Pass when they click on that button. And of course, the update button function hides the button if the player owns the Game Pass or not, and we don't actually have to make any changes to the update button function, because that logic was already written, and it doesn't matter if it was a Game Pass or a subscription. The only thing that actually mattered in this scenario was if it was owned or not, and now we're actually checking if a Game Pass is being owned the correct way. Now we have to do one more thing inside of this module, and that is updating what happens when the update state event is fired off. Currently, we update one of the buttons if the action is update VIP, but we also want to do this if the action type is also update Game Pass. So we'll go ahead and create a variable called isGamePass, and we'll check if the action type equals update Game Pass. So then we can go ahead and add in an else if here, and we'll say else if is Game Pass then, and if it is a Game Pass, we'll go ahead and call the update button function, passing through the action.GamePassID and passing through the action.value to tell the function whether or not the Game Pass is owned or not. So now when a player does purchase a Game Pass and that is replicated from the server side down to the client, we will now hide the button because they did purchase the Game Pass. And with that being said, we're fully finished with updating this module script, so we can go ahead and close out of that. We are also done inside of the GUIs folder, so we can go ahead and collapse that. We will come back because we are going to make another controller, so we can leave that expanded if you like to. But now we are actually going to go back to working on the server side a little bit because we're going to go ahead and create a brand new service. To create a brand new service, we'll go ahead and save our time a little bit by duplicating one of our already existing service modules. So I'll just go ahead and duplicate the skip service. Then I'll go ahead and rename this from being called skip service to being called tool service and open that up. Now, inside of here, we only actually need the replicated storage so we can delete each of those other services. And then for our other variables, we are going to need the player data service, but we don't really need anything else. Except we are going to actually need the store config, so that's why I left one of those config variables, and then we'll go ahead and rename this from stages config to being the store config. Now that we've done that, we can delete everything inside of the onStart function, but leaving the onStart function because we will actually use that, and then we can delete every other function that's created inside of here as well. So once you've cleaned your module script up, you should be left with something that looks pretty similar to this. So the first thing we're going to do inside of the tool service is go ahead and create a function. This function is going to be part of the shared table because it's going to be used by other scripts, and it's going to be called give tool. Now this function is going to have two parameters. The first parameter is going to be the player that we want to give the tool to, and the second is going to be the tool, which is actually going to be one of our Game Pass names. So we can say store config dot Game Pass name. Now I actually probably should have explained what I meant by tools when we were creating the service. Essentially what I'm referring to by tools is sort of the gravity coil and the speed coil. Going into this, I designed it with the mindset of allowing this to work for any other tools that you would like to implement into your game, which I'm not exactly sure what other tools would really apply to an Obby, for example, but when I say tool, I'm referring to the literal tool object type that Roblox has, which is stored inside of a player's backpack, or if they actually are holding the tool, then it's actually technically stored inside of their character. Another tool, for example, aside from either of these coils would be like a pickaxe. Is just one of the first ones that come to mind. So basically, we're essentially designing this system where if you wanted to add in another equipable tool, again, like a pickaxe, for example, most of this logic would be written for you to actually be able to do that, like putting the tool in the right spot where it needs to go, like the player's backpack, for example. Now, of course, you would need to modify some logic to accommodate for just that and not only game passes. And again, we are only using this for our two coils, so we literally could have just called this like the coil service, for example. But like I said, when I was originally designing this, and even now doing it this way, I think is a good way for if you feel confident enough, you should be able to easily expand off of this system, rather than if I made some system that was very, very specific to our coil setup and would only work with that, period. Anyways, the whole main point of that is to say, anytime you hear us say tool today, keep in mind we're referring to the coils as a tool, for example. So with this function, what we want to do is we want to check if the player owns the tool that we want to give to them. And if they do own the tool, then we're going to give them that tool. And how we're going to give that tool is we are going to clone that tool, which we have stored inside of the replicated storage. And then we're going to put a clone of that tool inside of the player's backpack, which once we put that inside of their backpack, that player will be able to see at the bottom of their screen a little hotbar sort of thing appear where they could press the 1 key, for example, and then actually equip that tool and hold it in their hand. So let's get started with writing the logic for this. In order to determine if the player owns the tool or not, we have to go ahead and get their state. So let's go ahead and create a variable called state, and to get the player state, of course, we use the player data service dot get state. We'll pass through the player. Now, if we're unable to get their state, then we're going to go ahead and stop the function right there. After that, though, we want to go ahead and check if they own the tool. So we're going to go ahead and create a variable called owns tool. And to determine if they own the tool or not, we can go ahead and use the store config, because inside of here, we have the does player own Game Pass function, which we can go ahead and pass through the player state as well as the tool to. Now, if the player does not own that tool, then let's go ahead and stop the function right there, because we don't want to give them a tool if they don't own it. Then after that, we want to go ahead and get the player's backpack. So let's go ahead and create a variable called backpack. And to get the player's backpack, there's two ways that we have to go about this. First, and the most common scenario, is we can simply just index the player object with backpack to actually get their backpack. But if there's some odd scenario, like maybe the player's respawning, or maybe the player's not fully finished loading in, the other way that we can get their backpack is, well, we would actually have to wait for it. So we would say, or, then using the player object once again, this time we'll use the wait for child method, and we will wait for the child, which is called backpack, to appear on the player. Then after that, if we are not able to get a backpack, then we want to stop the function right there, because we can't give the player a tool if we haven't gotten their backpack. But now that we've gotten their backpack and we know that they do own the tool, we can go ahead and give them the tool. And now to give them the tool, like I said, we need to clone the tool, which is stored inside of the replicated storage, and then we need to parent that clone into their backpack. So let's go ahead and create a variable called clone, which is going to be equal to the replicated storage dot tools, and then we're going to index that folder with the name of the tool. So we'll go ahead and say tool. Then we'll go ahead and clone that tool. And now that we've cloned that tool, let's go ahead and parent the clone into the player's backpack. And one thing to keep in mind here that's pretty important is that when we're using this function, when we say tool, again, what we're actually using is the Game Pass name. So we're not passing through an ID or a number here. We would pass through something like Gravity Coil. And keep in mind that our Game Pass name has a space between the word gravity and the word coil. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that the Game Pass name is exactly the same name as the tool that is stored inside of the tools folder inside of the replicated storage. Because if the name of the tool is not the exact same as the Game Pass name, then when we try to find that tool inside of the tools folder, we're going to get an error here because the name is actually different. So make sure you're keeping your name consistent. Make sure that there's either a space between both the Game Pass name and the tool name, or there's no space in both of those names. The space particularly doesn't matter, but the consistency does. You want to make sure that you keep that name the same in pretty much every single spot. Anyways, now that we've created this function, like I said, it is a shared function, so we're going to use it somewhere outside of the script, but we also do want to use it inside of the script as well. When it comes to using this function outside of the script, where we're actually going to use this is when the player purchases a Game Pass. So whenever the player purchases the Game Pass, then we're going to go ahead and use this function in order to give them that Game Pass that they've just purchased. So give them the Gravity Coil, for example. But in addition to that, we also need to make sure that we give the player the tool every single time they join the game and every single time their character respawns as well. So we're going to go ahead and set that logic up inside of the onStart function right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the player data service because we want to go ahead and use the profile loaded event. So we'll say .event :connect, create an anonymous function inside of here. Of course, the only parameter that we're going to use inside of here is the actual player. That's profile has just been loaded. And once the player's profile has been loaded, we're going to go ahead and try to give them both of the tools. So we'll go ahead and say shared.giveTool. We'll pass through the player. And for the first tool, we'll go ahead and pass through Speed Coil. Then we'll go ahead, copy and paste this. And this time we'll go ahead and try to give them the Gravity Coil, just like that. So now we're trying to give them the tools when they join the game for the first time. Keep in mind, if they don't own the tools, we already kind of checked that inside of this function. So if they don't own them, the tools will not be given to the player. So now that we're trying to give it to them when they log in for the first time, like I said, we also have to give it to them every single time their character respawns as well, because every single time a player dies, their backpack is actually wiped out and they lose the tool that they were holding. So to account for that, what we need to do is we're actually going to listen to the character added event on the player, and we're going to go ahead and connect that to an anonymous function, which we don't even care about getting the actual character. So now that we're listening for every single time the character is added, what we're going to do is copy both of these lines and paste that directly inside of here. So every single time the player's character respawns, we're going to go ahead and once again try to give them both of the coils. And now with that being said, we're fully finished with creating the tool service, so we can go ahead and exit out of here. And now since I already had the store service opened up, we're going to go back inside of the store service and we're going to use the tool service that we just created. So towards the top of the store service script, we're going to go ahead and create another variable for the tool service. So we'll go ahead and say tool service and then update this variable name right there. And now what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to scroll all the way back down to the Purchase Gamepass function, because all the way at the end we have a comment that we left here which says to do reward player. So once the player does purchase the Game Pass and we do actually update their state to reflect that they do own the Game Pass, we're going to go ahead and give them the tool that they just purchased. Now, because of how the logic of this function is set up, we only get the ID of the Game Pass. And so far inside of here, we've never needed to use the name of the Game Pass, so we don't actually have that information yet. So what do we need to do? Well, we have to get the name of the Game Pass from the Game Pass's ID. So we're going to go ahead and create a variable called Gamepass Info, and to get the info about a specific Game Pass, we're going to go ahead and use the store config. We'll go ahead and use the Get Gamepass Info function, and we'll pass through its ID. And now that we have all the information about that Game Pass, we can go ahead and use that function from the tool service. So give tool, we'll go ahead and pass through the player. And then for the tool, what we're going to pass through is Gamepass Info .name, just like that. So now we're actually giving the player the tool when they purchase the Game Pass in our game. And with that being said, we're fully finished with updating the store service, so we can go ahead and close out of that module script as well. And we're pretty much fully finished with implementing this entire thing, but we have one more controller to make, and that is the tools controller. So with that being said, we can collapse the entire server script service, and now let's take a look inside of the controllers folder. Inside of here, let's just go ahead and duplicate one of our currently existing controllers. I'll go ahead and duplicate the VIP controller and rename one of these to be called the tools controller. Then I'll go ahead and open that up. And now inside of here, we do need the player service, but we don't need the replicated storage or the text chat service. Instead, we actually do need the workspace service though. So let's go ahead and create a variable for that. Then we do not actually need the state controller or the remotes variable, so we can go ahead and delete those. We also don't need most of these variables here, so we can delete all of them. When it comes to the functions, we are going to need the onStart function, but we don't need anything inside of it. And then we can delete all of the other functions that we've created inside of here as well. So once you've cleaned the module script up, this is what yours should look like. Now, below our service variables, we're going to go ahead and create a variable for the local player, which of course we're going to call player. So we can go ahead and get the local player by saying players.localPlayer. Then after that, we're going to go ahead and create a type, which is going to be called coil, and then we're going to specify the names of both of our coils. So our first coil is going to be called Speed Coil, and our second coil is going to be called Gravity Coil. Now, alternatively, you could require the store config and then just use the Game Pass name type that we created earlier, but at the same time, you may add in more Game Passes, so that type might be a little bit too large for the scale of what we're actually going for here, so it might be better to create the coil type like we just did now. Anyways, after that, we're going to go ahead and create another variable, which this variable is actually going to be a constant, so we're going to type it in all capital letters, and it's going to be called coil_effects, and it's going to be equal to a table. Now inside of this table, we're going to create 3 more tables. And now each of these tables are going to store key value pairs. The keys are going to be property names that we're going to modify in order to give the player this special effect from that coil. Like for instance, let's go ahead and add in the speed coil. So we're going to go ahead and say speed, which is going to be equal to another table. And now what properties is the speed coil effect going to modify? Well, it would actually modify the walk speed property of the player's humanoid. Now, what do we want the player's walk speed to be while they actually have the speed coil out? Well, I'm going to go ahead and set the player's speed to about 50. Of course, you can feel free to set it to whatever you'd like, but that's the only property that's going to be modified when the player is using the speed coil. Then after that, of course, we have the gravity coil. Now, what properties will the gravity coil affect? Well, of course, it'll actually affect the gravity, which we're going to lower down to about 100, and we'll also adjust the jump height property of the player's humanoid to about 50 in order to make the player jump higher and also affect their gravity so that they fall slower as well. Then finally, we're going to have one more table inside of here, which is going to be called default. And now inside of this table is where we're going to add all of those properties, and the value of each of those properties are going to be what it should be when the player is not using either the speed or the gravity coil. So we'll first start with the walk speed. The default walk speed should be 16. At least that's what it is in my game, and that's what it is in Roblox games by default. Then we can specify the default gravity, which the default gravity is 196.2, and then the default jump height is 7.2. And I forgot to add a comment there, but there we go. So like I said, this table is going to be used when we're actually modifying these different properties like the walk speed, the gravity, and the jump height. And since we're making this into a constant, it's really easy for us to come back in the future, look at the script, and just looking at this table, we can clearly see what properties we actually have to modify in order to change the effects. Anyways, now that we've created that variable, let's actually go ahead and write the logic for implementing these effects and modifying these different properties. So below the onStart property, we're going to go ahead and create another function, which is going to be part of the local table, and it's going to be called Coil Effect. Now, this function is going to have 2 parameters. The first parameter is a specific coil, which would be of the coil type. So what coil do we want to apply the effects of? And the second argument is going to be called didEquip, which is going to be a boolean, because essentially we're going to write this function for modifying those properties based on when the player equips or unequips the specific coil. Now, in order to modify these properties, we first need to get the player's humanoid. So to do this, we'll go ahead and create a variable called humanoid. And now to get their humanoid, we're going to go inside of the player, inside of their character, and then we're going to wait for a child called humanoid. Then, of course, if we do not get the humanoid, we're going to go ahead and stop the function right there. Now, as long as we did get the humanoid, what we're going to do is we're going to check what type of coil it is. If the type of coil is gravity coil, then what are we going to do? Well, we're going to adjust the property on the humanoid called jump height. Now, that property is not actually automatically suggested to us, so let's go ahead and specify the type of the humanoid variable to be an actual humanoid object. Now that we specified that, we can go ahead and say humanoid dot, and we can actually see jump height is suggested to us right there. And then how are we going to set this property? Well, if the player did equip the coil, then what we're going to set this to is coil effects.gravity.jump height. Otherwise, we're going to set it to coil effects.default.jump height. In addition to modifying the jump height property, we also have to modify the gravity property. And now the gravity property is not actually in the player's humanoid. Instead, the gravity property is actually a property of the workspace service. So we would need to say workspace.gravity equals, if did equip, then we would use, of course, coil effects.gravity.gravity. Otherwise, we would use coil effects.default.gravity. So when the player equips the coil, we'll go ahead and use the effects of the coil, but otherwise, if the player unequipped the coil, then we'll go ahead and use the effects of the default. So we'll go ahead and reset the properties back to the default value. Then we'll go ahead and say else, because if it is not a gravity coil, then of course we need to implement the effects for the speed coil. And now what are we going to modify for the speed coil? Well, we would go ahead and adjust the humanoid's walk speed property. So if they did equip it, then what are we going to do? Well, we'll say coil effects.speed.walk speed. Otherwise, we'll go ahead and say coil effects.default.walk speed to reset it back to their their original walk speed. And now that we've created this function, we can go ahead and use it, but to use it, we actually need to create another function, which again is going to be a part of the local table, and this function is going to be called Setup Coil. Now this function is going to have a single parameter, which is going to be called tool, and it's going to be of the tool type. And in order to set up a tool or a coil, what we want to do is we want to listen for the tool to be equipped or unequipped. And then of course, we'll go ahead and trigger the Coil Effect function based on both of those events. So we'll go ahead and say tool.equipped, connect, create an anonymous function inside of here. And now if the tool was equipped, we'll go ahead and call local.coil effect. We'll pass through the name of the tool, and we'll pass through true because it was equipped. And now after that, we'll go ahead and listen to the unequipped event. We'll go ahead and connect to that, create an anonymous function inside of here. And again, we'll go ahead and call the Coil Effect function. We'll pass through the tool.name, and this time we'll pass through false because it was not equipped that time. Instead, it was, of course, unequipped. Now, we are finished creating that function, but we do have to create another function, which is going to use that function. This function is going to be part, again, of the local table, and this function is going to be called Setup Character, and it's going to accept a player. Now, this function is going to be called every single time the player's character actually respawns, because each time the player's character respawns, we need to go ahead and reset up each of the coils or each of their tools. Now, the first thing that we're going to do inside of this function is go ahead and get the player's character. We, of course, can do that by saying player.character, which if it's loaded already, then that works for us. But if it's not loaded for us, then we actually have to wait for the character to be added. And to wait for the character to be added, we would say or player.character added, wait. So this effectively is similar to using wait for child, and then we would just say character, but this is how you would actually do it to wait for a player's character to be added instead of using wait for child. Then in addition to that, we also want to create a variable for the player's backpack as well, and we've already done this on the server side, so we should already know how to get this, but to get the player's backpack, we would say player.backpack or player wait for child, and then we'll go ahead and wait for their backpack. Now, if we don't get their character or we don't get their backpack, then we're going to go ahead and stop the function right there. Now, one thing is we're actually not going to use the character inside of this function at all, but we still are waiting for it. And why is that? Well, there's two possible reasons. One, maybe when I was originally writing this code out, I used the character for some other reason and then I forgot to remove it. But another reason this might be for is it could also be for an edge case that I encountered maybe 1 or 2 times while writing this out. And then somehow I realized, oh, the reason that this is happening is because the character isn't loaded yet. So then I thought, oh, okay, let's just wait for the character to be loaded just to be safe. And that might be the alternative reason that we have this inside of here. Either way, it's not like there's any real performance difference between waiting for the character or not waiting for the character. I just want to be a little bit on the safer side. I'd rather include 1 extra line of code if it meant avoiding any errors. And in the worst case scenario, it just means we literally had to add an extra line of code and there's really no downsides to that. But anyways, now that we understand that, and now that we actually have their backpack, which is really the only thing that we care about, like I said, we don't actually care about the character. What we want to do with the backpack is we actually want to iterate through every single thing that's inside of the backpack and then set those tools up. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll go ahead and say for underscore comma tool in backpack get children do. And then we'll go ahead and call the setup coil function. So we'll say local.setupCoil, and we'll go ahead and pass through the tool. So now that'll take care of all the tools that are already inside of the player's backpack, but what happens if a tool gets added to the player's backpack later? Well, to make sure that those tools also get handled, what we're going to do is we're going to listen to an event on the backpack, which is called child added. So anytime a tool is added to the backpack, this event is going to be fired off. We'll go ahead and connect that to an anonymous function, which of course is going to give us a tool. And now what are we going to do when this event's fired off? Of course, again, we're going to go ahead and call the setup coil function, passing through the tool just like that. And with that being said, we're finished with creating this function as well. So now let's go ahead and actually use it. And of course, we're going to go ahead and use it inside of the onStart function. Now, when are we going to go ahead and try to set up the player's character? Well, of course, we're going to go ahead and try to set it up when they join the game for the first time. So let's go ahead and call that here. We'll go ahead and call the setup character function and pass through the player. And then in addition to that, we also want to call that function every single time the player's character has been added back into the game, which the character added event is fired off every single time the player's character respawns. So we'll go ahead and say player.character_added connect. Then we'll create an anonymous function inside of here because we don't actually care about the character. Instead, we're just going to go ahead and call setup character and pass through the player once again. So now we're setting up the player's character initially, and then every single time they respawn, we reset up the character as well, which will reset up all of the tools. And then, of course, the tools will apply their specific effect based on what tool they actually are. Okay. And now, with all of that being said, we have fully finished implementing the system into our game. Hopefully we made no mistakes, so let's go ahead and test this out. Now, if you were to test this out by simply just starting up your game, you'll actually have a pretty difficult time testing this out. And the specific reason for that is because if you try to test out owning Game Passes in your own game, Roblox will never prompt you to purchase a Game Pass in your own game because Roblox thinks that you already own that Game Pass if you made that game. So I just started my game up, for example, I'll click on Gravity, and when I click on Gravity, it literally says you already own this item, your account has not been charged. So we really can't test it that way. Instead, what we need to do to test this out is we can go to the Test tab, and inside the client and server section, we can set it to 1 player, or you can set it to 2 players. It really doesn't matter, but we really only need 1 player to test this out. Then go ahead and click the start button right here. And remember, the start button is different than the play here button or the play button. The start button will basically start up your game, but under almost a fake account, completely unrelated to your account. So this is a good way of actually trying to test out your game from the perspective of somebody other than your own account, which owns the game. Anyways, now that we've gotten into the game, when we look at my avatar, it looks exactly like my own avatar, but if we actually look at the leader stats, we can see that my name is Player 1. So this is not my actual Roblox account, this is a different one, it just has the same avatar. Anyways, now that we've done that, we can see the VIP button appearing as well as the Gravity and the Speed Coil button. Let's go ahead and click on the Gravity button. Okay, I almost forgot, but we have to go inside of the game settings, open up the monetization, open up the security tab, and then click Allow Third-Party Sales, hit Save. And now that we've done that, we can go ahead and start the test up once again. Cool. So now that we're back inside of here and we had that setting enabled, let's go ahead and click on Gravity. Once I click on Gravity, it prompts me to actually purchase this. And remember, at the bottom, it's very hard to see in this video, but it does say that this is a test purchase and your account will not be charged. So you don't have to worry about your account actually being charged. We'll go ahead and click that we bought it. Your purchase of the Gravity Coil succeeded. And then after a couple of seconds, we should actually see that the purchase has been processed. And we can now see that I do have a Gravity Coil in my inventory and the button has also disappeared as well. So now I can hold out the Gravity Coil, and when I jump, we can see that I jump very high, and we can see that the gravity is a little bit lower than what it was by default. Then when I unequip it, we can instantly see that that effect goes away, so we can see that the Gravity Coil is actually working, and so is the Game Pass system for purchasing it. Let's then go ahead and try the Speed Coil, so we'll go ahead and purchase the Speed Coil, and then after a couple of seconds, once the purchase has been processed, we do see that appears in our inventory as well. So let's go ahead and equip the Speed Coil, and we can see that I am moving very, very fast. We also saw that I did just respawn there, and even once I respawned, I still have both of the coils, and both of the effects are still working. So that does seem to be working perfectly as well. But anyways, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to be it for this episode. As always, if you did enjoy, make sure you smash the like button. Please leave a comment down below letting other people know that it did work. I and they really do appreciate it. It helps everyone out. And as usual, if you want to gain access to all the scripts and the game file that we made during this episode, as well as a ton of other assets, you can visit monster.dev or my Patreon, link down below in the description to both of these. You can gain access to a ton of assets to easily create your next Roblox game, as well as support me in creating all the content that I create. Anyways, with all that being said, I hope that you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next episode.